He smiled the day she left, not out of peace, but out of pride. What if the person you turned your back on came back, not to seek revenge, but to heal what you destroyed? What if forgiveness was the one thing that could set you free? After 7 long years, Clara stood once more before the home that had forgotten her. Behind those walls were the voices that once defined her world. Her mother's calm, her brother's laughter, her father's silence. The same silence that once broke her spirit. But she hadn't come for them to apologize. She came to show them what love looked like after being abandoned. Because sometimes, the greatest lesson isn't found in words. It's found in walking back through the pain that once drove you away. The silence after her name fell from her mother's lips was unbearable. Years of distance pressed into that single breath between them. Ethan's smile vanished, replaced by a confusion he didn't know how to hide. The air thickened with unspoken apologies and unfinished sentences. Clara's eyes drifted across the room that once held her childhood dreams, now filled with ghosts of who they used to be. She had imagined this moment 1,000 times, yet nothing prepared her for how small they all looked now, how fragile pride appeared under the weight of truth. It was Martha who spoke first, her voice trembling with the weight of years gone wrong. "You shouldn't have come back," she whispered, though her eyes begged forgiveness for the lie. Clara's heart ached at the sound of it, a mother torn between love and guilt. The room's warmth couldn't touch her. The distance was colder than any storm. Ethan couldn't speak. For years, he'd convinced himself that Clara's leaving was her choice, that she'd walked away easily. But seeing her now, soaked, shaking, eyes filled with silent forgiveness, tore through every lie he'd told himself. He realized the truth. She hadn't left. They had pushed her out. When Clara finally spoke, her voice was quiet, steady, but filled with something none of them expected. "Grace, I didn't come back to stay," she said softly. "I came back so we could all stop pretending." Her words broke the silence like sunlight through fog, and in that fragile moment they all realized, healing doesn't begin when you return home. It begins when you finally forgive the ones who never came looking for you. The house felt smaller now, the walls closer, as if it too feared the truth unfolding inside. Ethan paced near the window, avoiding Clara's eyes. Martha hovered by the kitchen counter, her hands fidgeting with a dish towel she didn't need. Clara watched them both, her chest tight, but her face calm. Years ago, this same kitchen had held laughter, warmth, the smell of her mother's baking. Now it smelled like rain and secrets. Sometimes, the hardest part of coming home isn't what you see. It's realizing how much everyone pretended not to notice when you were gone. Ethan finally broke the silence. "You shouldn't have just left," he said, his voice sharp but shaking. Clara turned to him, her gaze steady. "I didn't leave," she said. "You all made sure I couldn't stay." The words hung between them like glass, fragile, dangerous. Martha closed her eyes, tears slipping down unnoticed. The past they had buried so carefully began to claw its way to the surface. Martha's voice trembled as she tried to speak. "You don't understand what it was like after you left," she whispered. Clara turned, tears welling, but her tone soft. "You mean after you told me I was the reason he left?" The words cut through the air like lightning. The silence that followed was unbearable. For years, Clara had carried that wound, being blamed for her father's departure. And now, standing before them, she let it bleed in the open for the first time. The storm outside grew louder, as if echoing the chaos inside. Ethan's eyes darted between his sister and mother, guilt tearing him apart. He finally whispered, "We thought you'd moved on, Clara. She looked at him, her voice trembling but kind. "You didn't try." Her words were not cruel, only true. And that truth, simple as it was, broke him more than anger ever could. Martha finally moved closer, her steps hesitant, as if walking through years of regret. "I was scared," she said quietly. "When your father left, I didn't know how to protect any of us. I blamed you because it was easier than blaming myself." Clara's lips quivered. "I just needed you to believe me. Once." The words shattered Martha. She reached out, but Clara didn't move, not yet. Not yet. Forgiveness had not arrived, but understanding had begun. And sometimes, that's the first step toward peace. For a long time, no one spoke. The storm outside had quieted, leaving only the sound of rain dripping from the eaves. Clara stared at her mother's trembling hands, the same hands that had once braided her hair before school. "Do you want to know where I went?" she asked softly. The question hung in the air like a fragile thread. Ethan looked up, guilt clouding his eyes. Martha nodded, her throat too tight to answer. Clara took a breath, the kind that comes before a wound finally opens. "I didn't disappear," Clara began. "I was taken in by people who had nothing, yet gave me everything. They taught me how to start again." Her voice trembled, not from fear, but from remembering. "There were nights I wanted to come home, but I remembered the look in your eyes, Mom. The way you looked at me, like I was the reason he left. So I stayed gone." Martha's tears finally fell, her body shaking. The weight of years pressed into the floor between them, heavy and unforgiving. Ethan stepped closer, his voice breaking. "Why didn't you tell us? Why didn't you ask for help?" Clara turned toward him, her eyes soft. "Because I did. You just didn't listen." His breath caught. He remembered the letter, the one he'd found years ago, but never opened. Guilt flooded through him like fire. Sometimes the truth isn't hidden, it's ignored, waiting for someone brave enough to face it. Martha stood slowly, her tears silent now. "Clara?" she whispered. "If I could go back..." Clara shook her head gently. "You can't. None of us can." Her tone wasn't cruel. It was true. "But you can still choose what kind of people we'll be now." The words carried a quiet authority, the kind that comes only from surviving. Martha looked at her daughter, not as the girl who left, but as the woman who had returned stronger than any of them. Ethan reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, wrinkled envelope. "The letter. I kept this," he said quietly. "I never read it." Clara looked at him, her voice barely a whisper. "Then maybe now's the time." As he opened it, his eyes filled with tears before he even finished the first line. The letter spoke of love, not anger, of hope, not blame. In that moment, something inside all three of them broke. Not from pain, but from the first real piece of healing they had ever shared. Ethan's hands trembled as he unfolded the letter, its paper yellowed and edges torn by time. The ink had faded, but Clara's handwriting, delicate and careful, still spoke from another life. He began to read, his voice uneven. "Dear Mom, dear Ethan, I forgive you." The words froze them. Forgiveness written in the same lines that once carried pain. Clara watched quietly, tears brimming, but unfallen. That letter had never been meant to wound. It was meant to heal, even if no one ever read it. Ethan's voice cracked as he continued reading. "I'm learning that love isn't about staying. Sometimes it's about leaving, to find the pieces of yourself no one else could see." He stopped, glancing up at Clara. She gave him a faint nod, her expression filled with peace. Martha covered her mouth, tears spilling freely now. "I never knew you forgave us," she whispered. Clara's voice was soft. "You were never ready to hear it then." Clara looked down at her hands, remembering the years that shaped her after she left. "I worked in a small-town hospital," she said quietly. "I helped people who had no one. I guess I became who I needed back then." Her voice shook slightly, but there was pride in it. Quiet, earned, unshakable. Ethan's eyes filled again, realizing how much she'd grown without them. Martha reached out, her fingertips brushing Clara's knuckles, hesitant but tender. I used to dream, Clara continued, that one day I'd walk back through that door and you'd see me. Not as the mistake, not as the reason he left, but as your daughter again. Her voice broke, but she smiled through it. Martha's tears came harder now, her face softening with every word. I see you now, she whispered, her voice cracking. Ethan bowed his head, whispering, So do I. And for the first time in years, they meant it. As the last words of the letter faded into silence, the storm outside finally stopped. The world beyond the window looked still, washed clean. Clara exhaled deeply, as if setting down the weight she'd carried for half her life. Martha stepped forward and wrapped her arms around her daughter, hesitant at first, then fiercely, desperately. Ethan joined them, his hand resting on Clara's shoulder. For the first time, they stood together, not as a broken family, but as one learning how to begin again. The morning after brought a calm that felt almost unreal. The storm had washed the world clean and sunlight streamed softly through the kitchen windows. Clara stood by the counter, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea. Martha hummed quietly as she cooked. The first sound of peace the house had heard in years. Ethan sat by the window, eyes red but calm, the unreadable mix of guilt and relief on his face. Healing doesn't come in one night, but that morning, it began to grow roots. Martha placed a plate in front of Clara, her movements unsure, like someone learning to speak a forgotten language. It's your favorite, she said softly. Pancakes, just like when Clara was little. Clara smiled faintly. The kind that carried both love and loss. I remember, she said. For the first time in years, they ate together without anger, without words left unsaid. Sometimes forgiveness looks like a meal shared in silence. Whoa, shout. Ethan cleared his throat, breaking the quiet. I found something in Dad's workshop last year, he said, standing and walking to the hallway. He returned holding an old, dust-covered box. He never sent it, but it was for you. Inside was a photo of Clara as a child and a letter in their father's handwriting. Her breath caught as she read, He didn't leave because of you. Ethan whispered. He left because he thought he was the problem. The truth unraveled the last knot in her heart. The letter was short, but it said everything she'd needed to hear for years. If I could, I'd tell her she's my proudest reason to keep going. Clara folded the paper slowly, pressing it to her heart. Martha walked to her, whispering, He did love you, Clara. We both did. We just didn't know how to show it. Clara smiled through her tears. You're showing me now. And in that single moment, decades of pain began to fade. Later that afternoon, the three of them stood outside the house, the same house that had once held so much pain. Clara looked toward the horizon, her heart lighter than it had been in years. I used to think forgiveness was about forgetting, she said softly. But it's not. It's about remembering without letting it hurt anymore. Ethan smiled faintly. Martha reached for her daughter's hand, and as the wind brushed through the trees, it felt like even the past had finally exhaled. Days passed, and the quiet of the house changed. It no longer echoed with regret, but with the soft rhythm of life returning. Martha began humming again as she cooked. Ethan came home early from work, just to sit and talk, and Clara, for the first time in years, felt at home. Not because the walls remembered her, but because the people inside finally did. Healing wasn't loud or sudden, it was gentle, like the first rays of light after a long night. Ethan pointed to a photo of them as children, both covered in mud, laughing wildly. You were always braver than me, he said with a soft chuckle. Clara smiled. I had to be. The words weren't bitter. They were truth wrapped in love. Martha looked at them, her heart breaking and healing all at once. She realized that time had not taken her children, pride had, and now, watching them laugh again, She swore never to lose them to silence again. Later that evening, Clara found herself standing in her old room, the one frozen in time. Posters still clung to the faded walls, and the bedspread she once loved was neatly folded. She ran her fingers across the desk, where her initials were still carved. Memories flooded back, of dreams she had before everything fell apart. She smiled to herself. The pain that once haunted this room now felt like a story that had finally found its ending. As the night fell, Martha joined her in the doorway. "You've grown so much," she whispered. Clara turned, smiling. "So have you, Mom." They stood for a moment, looking at the old room, the place where both love and pain had been born. Then Martha spoke, her voice breaking gently. "I want to make things right, Clara. Not just say sorry. Live differently." Clara nodded. "That's all I ever wanted." And in that exchange, apology became promise. Later, as they sat outside beneath the stars, Clara rested her head against her mother's shoulder. Ethan joined them quietly, placing a blanket over their laps. None of them spoke. They didn't need to. The silence was no longer painful. It was peaceful. Clara looked up at the night sky and whispered to herself, "Maybe this is what coming home really means." The stars above shimmered, as if nodding in agreement. The morning was still, the kind that holds its breath before goodbye. Clara packed her small suitcase, the same one she arrived with, now lighter. She moved quietly, her motions unhurried, each one filled with calm. Martha watched from the doorway, her heart heavy but grateful. "You're leaving?" she asked softly. Clara nodded. "Not forever. Just forward." Martha smiled through tears, understanding at last. Healing had done its work, and it was time to let it go. Ethan entered the room, his voice low. "You sure you don't want to stay?" he asked. Clara smiled faintly. "I think this time I'm leaving for the right reasons." He nodded, eyes glistening. "Then come back when you're ready. Not because we need you, but because you want to." For the first time, there was no guilt, no distance, just understanding. They embraced, and the years of silence between them disappeared in a single heartbeat. Outside, the garden looked different now. The same flowers that had once wilted from neglect now stood tall after the rain. Martha joined Clara on the path, carrying a small wrapped box. "For you," she said, handing it over. Inside was a silver bracelet, the one Clara used to wear as a girl, polished and shining. "It's time it belonged to you again." Clara's throat tightened. "Thank you for finding me again. You found us first," Martha whispered. The old car's engine hummed quietly as Clara placed her suitcase inside. Ethan stood on the porch, Martha beside him, both waving but not crying this time. Clara turned back once more, her heart full. "Take care of each other," she said. "I already lost one home. Don't lose this one too." They nodded, holding hands. As Clara stepped into her car, she realized something. She hadn't come back to fix them. She came back to remind them that love was never truly gone, only waiting to be chosen again. As the car rolled down the long country road, Clara looked into the rearview mirror one last time. The house grew smaller in the distance, but her heart felt bigger than ever. She whispered to herself, "Sometimes, coming back isn't about staying. It's about showing them how to move on." The sky ahead was clear, the storm long gone. And for the first time, Clara didn't feel like she was running away. She was simply moving forward, free, forgiven, and whole.